Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our final part of our four-part series, Presidential Trappings, which was organized by New Canaan Library and the New Canaan Museum and Historical Society. My name is Kayla Del Biondo, and I'm coordinator of adult programming and outreach here at the library, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Alicia Cheng here with us tonight. Alicia is graphic designer and founding partner at MGMT Design. She has taught and served as a visiting critic at Yale University, Princeton University, the Maryland Institute College of Art, Barnard College, Parsons School of Design, the Cooper Union School of Art, and the Rhode Island School of Design. Alicia served on the board of the AIGA New York chapter and received her BA from Barnard College and her MFA from Yale. She currently serves as head of design at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So I'd like to thank you, Alicia, for being with us here tonight to go over the history of ballot design.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm happy to be part of this series, which sounded great. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to attend the other segments, but I'm happy to sort of bring this series in for a landing. So I will share screen and we can get rolling. Okay. All right, so just want to make sure you can see that okay.
That's good.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Okay, so thank you for attending. I know it can sometimes be hard. It's easy to sign up for online events, but maybe hard to attend them. So I appreciate you giving some time this evening. So I'm here tonight to talk about a project that I call This Is What Democracy Looked Like, past tense, a visual history of the printed ballot. So usually I'd like to sort of start a little bit with how it all began for me as a graphic designer, and certainly not a historian and not a political scientist. But it was me reading an article in the New Yorker by Jill Lepore, who's everyone should know. It was an article about sort of early voting practices, and she went on to describe just sort of an amazingly vivid description of how challenging it was to cast your vote, you know, at the risk of life and limb, and also that people were sort of holding colorful ballots in their hand, which even that phrase unto itself was really intriguing to me. So that led me to various libraries and sort of more, I would say, recreational research, where if I was in LA, I went to the Huntington, which is a beautiful site, our California Historical Society, and of course here in New York, where I'm calling from. So I just began basically this sort of massive indoctrination period of just sort of self-teaching myself about sort of the practices of voting in early sort of post-colonial America. So that whole exercise was incredibly enlightening to me as a graphic designer and an English major, but never like a huge student of American history specifically. But this whole sort of link through the idea of what following the ballot itself, its form, and following that sort of materiality through time began a whole journey that revealed so much more than just sort of about democracy, actually. So the whole story begins with how ballots start with something like this, you know, very boring, very bureaucratic. They're the most direct tool of our participatory democracy, and it's the way we express ourselves as citizens. So, ballots themselves are really a reflection also of the incredibly uneven evolution of democracy, and clearly speaking to you now after Election Day versus many of the engagements I had sort of leading up to it is different. But, you know, it clearly proves that it's shown that our whole journey towards democracy is not an easy path. One historian called it a checkered tale of motion forward, backward, and sideways. But using the ballot, you can sort of see how it was explicitly used by the parties as a way to exercise power and control. So if this is what we recognize as a ballot today, you may not know that ballots also used to look like this from 1864. This from 1878, this from 1865, and this one from 1870, which is one of my favorites. You know, at the time that I was talking a lot about the book and the project, this was the reality we were facing. This year has been, you know, unprecedented, as the word is, and continues to be. but it's a reflection too of how far we are in terms of what voting used to be here. Obviously, typically as a reminder, voting really didn't take that long to do. It's pretty dull, it's kind of uneventful. You mark your ballot at sort of rickety table, you have your little privacy screen, and you get a sticker. But in the early days of our republic, voting used to look like this. A typical voter profile was white, male, and landowning. And you would go to the schoolhouse and know everybody there. You could enjoy, a glug of free whiskey like that gentleman on the lower left to help guide your choice. And then you were asked verbally how you wanted to vote, and you declared your preference out loud. So the candidate would often also be there in person, which I think is kind of adorable, and would stand up and thank you. This system was called viva voce and was, used by the Greeks before paper, along with other simple methods like raising your hand or even lining up on opposite sides of the room. I mean, the Iowa caucus practice is a good example of this now. So these systems worked fine for small communities, but as the country grew and immigration became a significant factor, the scale became much harder to manage. So let's look at some ballots. The meat of what I'll show you today is basically like a 70-year span from 1820s up until the turn of the century. I should say too that my research in focusing on ballots, they shouldn't really exist. In fact, they're legally required to be destroyed. So those that survived have been called by one collector, a nice phrase that I like, called the most fugitive ephemera. I can't answer why they even are in existence, different collectors or people sort of tucking it away in their pocket. It's still an open question. So this is an example of a ballot from 1827. So, you weren't given an official ballot necessarily printed by the government to mark your choice. Instead, you may have filled in a piece of paper that looked like this, where the office was printed, but the voter would have to handwrite their preferences in. Or you would hand a bunch of smaller ballots like these, which were pre-printed for the voter to submit. So you have offices here on the front and the names here on the back. It's worth mentioning too that in the early days of the Republic, there were no government issued ballots, and there certainly were no regulations of what they looked like or how they were produced. So as the electorate grew, it was easier for the states and the municipalities to have the parties print their own ballot. They could deal with the sort of significant expense of production and distribution. You can imagine it was a crazy amount of organization, but also and easy for maybe the states and the governments to cede control. But imagine the amount of power. You don't have to imagine. It gave the parties an amazing amount of control and power that allowed the parties to basically put the political foxes in charge of the electoral henhouse, and no federal oversight at the time too. So considering where we are now and the sort of outrage at the ballot counting, imagine where the parties had full control. So the other thing to really note is that you don't know who you were voting for, because at this point you would have rival parties with man booths to persuade voters and hand out ballots at the polling place. So you would have a list of candidates for each party, and this was called a straight ticket. So voting demanded full loyalty to a party all the way down. You couldn't sort of pick cross party or split your ticket at all. So that said, it was a heyday really for printers who were left to their own devices really to typeset ballots. There were some consistencies with some of the party emblems, but there was a huge range. These are from the 1870s, where you can see tremendous variety between regular Democratic ticket, et cetera. Or different emblems and signifiers at the top of the ballot. So this was definitely pre, elephant and donkey days, but it became, the rooster became the more recognizable emblem for the Democratic national ticket. But it was also a tool for people who were less literate or illiterate to say, like, vote for the ship rather than the weird Dr. Seuss-like tree in the middle. So there were some consistency. Obviously, the labor ticket had a consistent mark with a sort of hammer and fist. You notice in the center, I like this phrase called "be just and fear not." Some ballots had more blatant messages on them. These are two temperance ballots from the 1870s that depict the evils of drink in the form of fathers coming home to their families. And the small type on one of them on the left, I think, says, "Out of the grog shops come woe, misery, and death." So while ballots were given out to voters with no need to make any selections, not everyone, played by the rules. So you start seeing examples of voters using the ballot as a direct form of expression and a tool for protest, even today, actually. So in light of that, it's interesting to see this kind of sample from Mississippi a few years after Lincoln was assassinated and during the Reconstruction period. And you can see how this voter put a line through every option on the ballot, for Constitution, against Constitution, all the way down the line, presenting his own docket of candidates. So it was really, a strident vote of protest against the current administration. But, in a way you can see the link between this kind of gesture and the write-in areas in today's ballot, which is a nod really to the demand for an area for free expression. We'll talk about this more later, but it's really, a way for people to send the sort of direct message to the administration if they can. So as I was saying, the population was growing, the sort of inclination to sort of have the government be more for the people, made the offices grew, everything was growing exponentially. So the number of candidates which required the voter to vote for became much more extensive. So this is also how you derive the idea of a party ticket, is because it kind of looked like a railway ticket in terms of its length. So here are some examples of what are called scratched ballots. We think that hanging chads are confusing, but the election rules also varied so that sometimes some municipalities required you drew a line through the person you didn't want, but then sometimes it was through the line with some you did want. So you had to really pay attention. But I'll also say that finding these from a research capacity, seeing the actual pencil scratching and the mark making, from a human back then into what I was seeing was really sort of compressed time, which was really quite beautiful. So vandalizing in that way, sort of scratching it all over the place, was one thing, but there were other ways that candidates could get their name on the ballot if it didn't make it on the final printed piece. Keep in mind the sort of rules and regulations varied tremendously. So in terms of the deadline for submittal before it was getting typeset varied a lot. So these were something I discovered in this form at the New York Public Library. So they're called pasters. They had gummed adhesive on the back and they were sent to voters or made available at the polls themselves. So that you can see that here are some literally manhandled ballots where there's like cutting and pasting and working over. You really had to work hard and be quite a sort of scrapbooky type person to really get the names of the people you wanted on this ballot. So you can see how you can still see the sort of residual paste of it. So with that in mind, I was also seeing ballots that were like this one from 1870, where, it looks like a sort of typical letterpress one color print. But then you notice, like, why was Edward Flaherty's name so bizarre? And there really was no reason for this moment to have this much sort of curvy, kind of hand-drawn kind of quality. But then you start sort of thinking, like, when you put these two together, not only was typesetting on a curve like unusual and distinctive, but it also kind of served as maybe a typographic countermeasure for any efforts to paste or write over the name when you had something that's more like a straight paster. So then I started seeing different aspects of ballot designs of that period as definitely, ornamentally pleasing and of that era sort of Victorian decor, but, also sort of a defensive measure to some degree against writing in candidates in the white space that may be available. So this one has like intricate filler that fills in all the available space, or this background that's really barely legible, but it was really potentially designed as a deterrent. This is just my theory, but it seems to make sense. So here's an incredibly dense lithographic ballot from 1864. It's jam-packed with offices for presidential electors down to the sheriff and the coroner. It's really an amazing typographic specimen. Production and distribution is another really significant factor when you look at how these ballots were both produced and distributed. So keep in mind 1800s, Industrial Revolution, steam power, the railroad system. These advances directly affected printing and production methods that then get reflected on the nature of the ballots. So there was a combination of faster, cheaper methods of printing, broader distribution networks thanks to the railroad and other methods of distribution, and a growing population with more time on their hands and plenty of politics for their own entertainment. Coupled with that, printers eager to show off their new printing techniques and combination, and you get this kind of very extra example of an engraved ballot from Virginia, or these ballots that are super colorful even today, where innovations in ink processing and petroleum allowed for new chemical formulas that made colorful inks more long-lasting and vibrant and stable. So I can attest that these are as vibrant as the ones you see here. Or colored paper stock. Again, these are meant to be more distinctive at the polls when there's sort of the melee of everyone holding their ticket in their hand. It can be much more distinctive to be printed on a colored paper stock, but also paper at the time went from being produced from rags, which became very scarce, especially during the war, to wood pulp, which was much more plentiful. So all these confluence of elements, to me, I was just discovering them one by one and sort of putting things together in terms of how they affected the nature and the sort of loose timeline that was sort of forming for me as my research continued. So here's another good example. It's just like a ganged sheet. It's on a very vibrant yellow piece of paper, but these would be cut up and distributed at the polls. I like the sort of variety of typefaces here. Again, seeing it as a graphic designer too, and less a historian who is, more intent on filling in the sort of chronological journey, freed me up, I think, to sort of select and follow my nose, or follow my eyes, I think I should say. So this is a great example from San Francisco. It's a lithographic print with hand lettering in 2 colorways. And the sort of yellow is a bit of a mystery. It's hard to say, but it seems like the complexity of these ballots could be seen also as a deterrent to counterfeiters. Certainly people who are trying to be distinctive. One other method was to sort of produce something that looks awfully similar to a rival party. This is a good example of letterpress gone wild. If anybody's familiar with the process, it's very rectilinear and gridded. So seeing these typeset on a curve is just really kind of excruciating and kind of amazing at the same time. These from 1878 really threw me. The sort of precision of this multicolor print is really unusual. It's been amazing with this process too, taking these samples to, not physically, but images of them, to letterpress printers who are practicing today and having them theorize about the methodology involved with producing something so crisp. Going back to ballots not needing to exist really after they've been cast, potentially it was just used as a test run. That's possible. It could be an incredibly elaborate ballot that was not able to be counterfeited. It's an open question. No one will really know, but these are amazing samples. So, the fronts are amazing. The backs are even better. You would have the business on the front and then much more intriguing freedom on the back that were used for various things like, having the polling hours on the back here, or just sort of beautiful engraved patterns that sort of suggest a sort of, currency-like detail in terms of its engraving, or sort of more sort of bold graphic forms, or just sort of more messaging for the party, or just sort of beautiful compositions that become like abstract. So another thing I often find I need to focus on is the number of people, obviously with voting rights expanding during the 19th century, partisanship was inevitable, but there was also a mind-boggling number of political parties and splinter groups that went well beyond our 2-party system, as I mentioned. So this is an amazing diagram from the Smithsonian showing the evolution of American political parties from, I think, like 1789 to like 1860, but just to see the interweaving of the sort of, people maybe were more familiar with the Democratic Party in the early days, but sort of how it wove in, and each sort of splinter group formed their own kind of party, and so too had their own ballots. So you had your Democrats, your Republicans, your Democrat Republicans, your Free Soilers, your Know Nothings, your Working Mans, your Barn Burners. But then you also have these, like the Argonaut ticket. I don't know what that's about. The regular American, the anti-boss ticket, home rule for America. It was a really consistent message. And also the cactus ticket with a very cheerful looking succulent in the middle there. Other ballots had definitely more shocking illustrations on them as sort of an illustration of the party platform. So here are examples of ballots for parties based on anti-immigration and anti-Chinese platforms, calling for protection of white labor. You see, him barring the door to sort of Halloween style trick-or-treaters at the door that I think are meant to be Chinese, or sort of the WPC giving the Chinaman with the queue the boot back to his country from California. So lots of voters, lots of parties, lots of elections, lots of corruption, lots of violence at the polls, which, in many ways were accounts verify that they were sort of deliberately staged to deter less than stalwart voters. You really had to commit. And, maybe you were paid a good amount of money to show up at the polls and vote a certain way. But this is an image from Harper showing violence at the polls in like the 1850s or so. So Boss Tweed, Gangs of New York, that period. And, the tales of fraud were really stupendous, where, immigrants would arrive by the boatload, quite literally, naturalize en masse, and then walk directly to the polls. If I had another session, I would do a whole thing on ballot boxes and ballot box stuffing, voter impersonation accounts. One of my favorite stories was called Voting by Whiskers, where you could get 5 votes out of one man if he started the day with a beard and ended it clean shaven. Made for very colorful reading. I was assured by many historians that this was not like entirely rampant, that there was still some honesty at the polls. But just to say, things were getting out of hand, and this prompted a call for reform. This is useful to think of now, given everybody's this last experience that we had with the general election too. At least we're not voting with our facial hair progression. So, which leads us all to the Australian ballot, which can be a surprise to some people in terms of how Australia figures into sort of anything related to our democratic process. But indeed, their ballot, which was developed in Tasmania in 1859, had made its debut and was kind of radical because of simple elements that I think we will find kind of surprising. So it was produced and distributed and regulated by the government. So it was an official ballot. This was a new thing. All candidate choices were consolidated onto one ballot versus many separate ones, as I described before. And the biggest deal about this format was that the ballot was cast in secret. That, I think, is kind of mind-blowing to those of us who just don't remember anything else or just think that balloting was consistently secret. But you saw hopefully earlier that the journey to this moment was kind of a radical shift. And, not everybody loved it. People called it cowardly to hide your ballot choice. It was considered unmanly not to sort of declare your allegiances publicly. And also parties were worried that consolidating offices would vex the voter and provide too much, challenges in terms of the reviewing and the selection process. So, you can see with the introduction and the slow adoption that came to bear starting in Massachusetts of this ballot, it's radically different. It's huge. They had a term called the blanket ballot. This is one from 1900. Critics said the layout would discriminate against down ticket races due to voter fatigue. And I totally believe that because it's really complex. So, it's notable though that this moment in time, you're going from a public act of voting to a private one. And within this act, that transition, while it may have preserved voter integrity, et cetera, but it also caused a very precipitous drop in voter precipitation. You needed a high level of patience, knowledge, and literacy to know who you were voting for. So all of that made it a lot more challenging than accepting like a slug of whiskey and walking your ticket from the booth to the box. So Massachusetts, as I said, was the first state to adopt it in 1888, I think. And other states gradually used the system. So by the time Taft was president in 1908, it was more, Kentucky was a holdout. It wasn't always smooth, but generally the sort of generalized format was more adopted. But, it's not that old. So it means we've only been using our secret ballot system for a little over 100 years. We're a young country. So variations on that blanket layout began to emerge. This was from 1906, and it was grouped by office and still offers a straight party option for sort of the express lane type of choices. But then you also have this one that's organized by office, but also you can see these little emblems next to the name when you have candidates that are represented by more than one party. So also filling all the available space with these dingbats too, sort of, I feel like, I don't know if the printer sort of feeling like he needs to decorate. This one also has these sort of enigmatic geometric system showing the affiliations and how some candidates represent more than one party. And emblems start appearing again as a way to identify your party and vote a straight ticket. So, critics saw this as an insult to the intelligence of the voter, saying, there can be no improvement in government as long as voters cast their ballots for birds instead of men. But again, it helped for, faster identification, et cetera. So things were getting officially absurd when I came across this New York state ballot from 1912. It is 14 feet long. It contains 600 names, organized by a state interdistrict committee. And, you know, again, it's hard to sort of speculate on the rationale for doing it. I never found one that was marked. And I don't know if it was just a gesture sort of in defiance of the regulations insofar as saying you want our names, here are all our names. But concurrent with this, I was reading more about something called the short ballot movement, which is an attempt to sort of reform the reforms and try to make things more user-friendly. So by the late 1800s, you have the invention, as I said, of like telephone, light bulb, automobile. There's a lot of sort of, you know, enamored of the machine, zeal, and a sort of faith in how technology can save us from sort of the messy human factor, which all sounds very familiar now. So voting machines were hailed as the perfect solution against fraud because you know, took out sort of human factor and human counters. So here's an example. It's a patent drawing for the Myers automatic voting booth in 1889, which is a lever system, which is something we probably some of us remember fondly. In the interest of time, I'm basically like skipping over the entire 20th century because it's not half as exciting to look at. And you know, it involves more sort of propaganda type gestures, but the format is fundamentally the same. But obviously obligated to end on the infamous butterfly ballot of 2000, which, you know, in speaking to some students, they have no idea what I'm talking about. So it's worth remembering that this ballot used a punch card system, which is actually the yellow strip in the center. So you raise a frame with these names selection, slide the card underneath, put the frame down, and that blue thing is the stylus that you use to punch out your hole. So voters for Al Gore, which if you see my things right here, found their vote got counted for Pat Buchanan, which is just diagonally to the north. You know, alignment issues, it's not well designed. I'm not going to defend it. I am only going to say that I'm sympathetic to the problem when you have a system that doesn't match the sheer number of selections and there's no, you know, there's no design to this per se. You're just trying to solve a user problem, which is another discussion we can have about sort of contemporary ballot design. But seeing this ballot after a gallop through history can make you appreciate that while the old ballots are amazing, the artifacts of the material history of democracy, the themes are still with us. Ballots are still confusing, still hard to mark, still, you know, voter suppression is obviously a vivid issue right now, and electoral fraud. So it goes on. I like to close, there's a few more slides, but there's a quote from Alexis de Tocqueville, which, you know, I had to read him in high school and he's never felt more poignant than now. But he wrote of our democracy that while it does not give people the most skillful government, it produces what he called a superabundant energy that despite sometimes unfavorable circumstances can produce wonders. So I always say that it took 100 years to make the ballot look this boring, and that is progress. So I want to sort of show a little display that I was able to do in COVID times. This was in the windows of the Cooper Union School of Art in New York, in Astor Place. And we had planned a more gallery style exhibition, but the windows ended up being actually a more ideal solution. I could sort of fit more ballots in and the windows were, you know, ballot shaped, which was nice proportionally. So we produced these over the summer and they were up in early fall, I mean, up until election day. So it was a nice sort of display and also just sort of nice to see these good friends of mine of all these ballots shown at large scale. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Awesome visuals. And I see that we already have 2 questions coming in. Alicia is willing to take a few questions, folks. So if you do have any questions for her, we're going to be using the Q&A feature of Zoom rather than the chat. So let me go ahead with our first question. Someone asked, what does regular Republican ticket mean?
I can't speak to that specifically, again, as a graphic designer and a historian insofar as how to frame these. But, you know, if you refer to that Smithsonian thing of sort of how the regular Republican ticket versus the Democratic Republican ticket, or there's also a regular Democratic ticket, it all had to do with sort of platform differences and platform, you know, ways that they would distinguish themselves from their party. So, but there's a lot of those.
Thank you. Someone said, given the extreme variations in early ballots, do we have evidence or allegations of fraudulent tallying of votes?
Sure. Lots. I mean, I will say again that it's not like it was rampantly, fraudulent. There was honest voting, but people maybe gravitate towards those stories. But as I was referring to sort of ballot boxes and that kind of thing, in terms of the tallying, yeah, they would have these vivid stories of like getting the tally person like totally drunk and stealing this and that. And ballot boxes would have like trick panels that you would have to sort of put pressure in a certain sequence, and then it would allow for release of other ballots into the box. I mean, it was pretty amazing, the stories. I didn't have any samples that I found. There was one called a tissue paper ballot, which the idea is that it was in, I would imagine, like an onion skin type of paper. And then if you submitted it into the box, it would sort of explode into a multiple of like 10 or something. Those are these stories.
Oh, wow.
So yes, there was a lot of fraud up and down, but also in a way where in South Carolina, there was a story of they had what they called an 8-box rule, which was a series of one ballot box for every office that you had to be, again, quite literate to know what was labeled for what, because then they would switch them around. I mean, it's really kind of gross. You're like,
Oh, wow.
yeah, at every gesture, not only the type of ticket you're getting, how and again, you're not marking it, but where you put it. There's all sorts of ways through history that we've been trying to sort of subvert the vote.
Someone asked, do graphic designers currently participate in ballot designs?
They sure should. This has definitely galvanized my efforts to sort of, and there has been a lot of great movement in terms of having, Secretary of State's office and those offices that are tasked with the unfortunate burden of like trying to design the ballot. So the effort to try to embed those people within those groups, it's all about funding. There's a lot of willing people if they're able to donate their time. That's more rare. But initiatives that did have more funding produced things that, so say in Portland, for example, in Washington State, those ballots are more successful in many different ways, both from a layout standpoint and a system standpoint, because they were part of an initiative that was started by AIGA, the organization that is our founding chapter, to embed in fellows within those groups that are trying to formulate different. So it can happen. I think it's just a matter of calling for the funds on a government level to reform our system, and those who are often in control don't always want to do that. So right. There should be definitely more, but it's trickier than it should be.
Why were the ballot screens with flippers removed?
Oh, you mean the levers? Is that what that means?
Perhaps.
Screens with flippers is what I think.
Yeah.
Oh, you mean if you're talking about sort of like why I used to be able to vote with the big lever that went like this, and now it's not there anymore.
Perhaps.
So you can still do that in some places. It's but I think what's been interesting talking to sort of more current fellows, say the Brennan Center for Justice, who do a lot of work on this and who partner with organizations who are also trying to get better design into embedded. It's called oh my gosh, civic. Oh my gosh. Anyway, you can look it up. It's a Brennan Center related initiative. But that sort of after 2000, it was sort of like, oh, we need to really reassess. And it always ends up the sort of embrace with technology and the sort of, going from the lever to a digital screen, which can, be in different languages, large, all that stuff. But then people were not convinced that it was actually going through. And so you kind of needed to validate your vote with a piece of paper, like a receipt. So the prevailing theme for me was it always just comes back to paper. It's always, the vocal thing didn't work so well. The raising your hand only works so well. So I think that is one consistent theme that I was seeing throughout this whole historical kind of overview.
This is a good question. Someone wants to hear a little bit more about your book. Can you provide just a little bit of, insight, what people will find if they read it?
Well, it's heavy on the illustrations and the samples I showed you, because but the idea is it has an opening essay that kind of frames it, and then an essay by me who, it has a lot of these illustrations, these anecdotes that I've been describing in the talk. And then it closes with an essay by Victoria Bassetti, who is a fellow at the Brennan Center, sort of bringing it into current day. But the book is divided into different sections, much the same as how I organized it in the talk. But yeah, I mean, I do a lot of exhibition design and working with different curators. And I always used to, be so critical when they couldn't decide. I wanted to include all of their objects. And now I totally know, because it was really hard to edit the selection that's in the book. I only had so many pages. But yeah, it was a very end-to-end project for me in terms of like the research and then the writing and then the layout of the book and the exhibition. But it was a nice kind of reflection of my interests and my skills. So
awesome. We do have that book available in the library for anyone who's interested.
Yes, and if you'd like it permanently on your shelf, I encourage people to go get it through like bookshop.org and not so much the Amazon, but do as you wish.
We still have 6 more questions. Maybe we have time for 2 more if that's okay with you.
Sure, pick whatever.
Great. So 2 people kind of asked around the same question. They want to know, has there been a move towards a national style ballot, making ballots look the same state to state? It seems interesting that we still have a lot of variety in voting machines and ballots. 2 people asked kind of that along those lines.
And to that I say, God bless America. We can't even really get organized to wear masks, which, this before the election results and before January 20th, it would have seemed like. So yeah, it's hard to have national regulations. So what you can hope for is just sort of better practices. But it is kind of amazing. And, the scale of our democracy is really worth marveling over, to be honest. I mean, as highly flawed as everyone was examining, it's also amazingly successful. So let us take that, you can reframe it to some degree. So yes, it would make things a lot easier if it was much more, but there's a huge variety in the number of offices, the terms, et cetera. And it seems like there shouldn't be that much variety, but there's enough that already you would need so many exceptions to any kind of template. Mm-hmm. I think the bigger hope is to sort of, get better. And maybe this whole general election too is a slow but steady movement towards the demand for reform and more transparency towards the process. I found it interesting, even on the radio yesterday, I was at Union City, New Jersey, that they were suing the Department of State because the parties are in charge of what order the candidates' names were listed, which is exactly what happened back then. Like everyone was like wanted to be first in the column. So it keeps going on. So it's a good idea, but we'll see.
And then I think we'll end with this question. This seems like a fun one to end on. What is your favorite ballot? What is your favorite ballot from a design perspective?
That's hard. And
putting you on the spot.
The rainbow one just like made my jaw drop, that one that was all colored. I don't know. There was one, I think from a research standpoint, it was in the California Historical Society, and there was a sort of, random call number, and these things, when you put them in and you don't know what you're going to get. So it arrived on my desk as this huge crusty scrapbook, basically. And you opened it and it was like, it couldn't even close. And it was all these amazing ballots I'd never seen before, like full color front and back, but they were glued, just sort of one on top of another. Like, so I couldn't really photograph them well. Some of them I was able to. And that was just, all of it was amazing. So it's hard to me, it's like my children, or I only have one child, which makes it easy. I love, I don't have to make any choices.
Yeah.
But sort of seeing that kind of discovery just made me love everyone and just sort of delight in the form of it. So I was really fortunate, I think, to find a lens that provided a nexus of so many different bigger movements of, Industrial Revolution, electoral voting rights expansion, voter suppression, all of that was like, you could really see it through this lens, which I think was really revelatory to me.
Awesome. Well, you were able to answer 10 questions. That's awesome. Are you willing to share your contact information with people? I think, did you have your email listed on that last slide?
I did, but I can share it again. It's should I just say it? Or no, should I put
maybe in the chat, if you wouldn't mind like writing it into that chat. Sometimes people like to,
follow up,
send you their praises or a follow-up question.
There.
Perfect. So Alicia just put her email address in the chat for anyone who's interested in, staying connected. But I just want to thank you again so much for closing out our month-long series, Presidential Trappings. And I think everyone was super engaged and appreciative. We had a lot of thank yous in the question and answer. People were just like,
I'm glad.
great presentation, fantastic. So
Good.
I'm just gonna leave, I'll leave it open for another minute because it looks like people are saying more things to you in the chat. But thank you so much for your time, and
thank you for having me. I think it's great that the library has these kind of programs, and thanks for everybody for tuning in.
perfect.
And thanks for inviting me.
Yes.
Good luck with everything. Good luck with the renovation. It sounds amazing.
Thank you. Good luck with your new position at the Met.
You said?
18 to 24 months. So
from
we'll see. Breaking ground in June. That's public knowledge. So
that's exciting. Everybody should have a better library. So
we're pumped.
Great.
Well, thank you so much, Alicia, and have a great night, everyone.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Take care.
Bye-bye.